Dober dan. Danes je naš gost profesor Noam Chomsky, eden izmed najbolj znanih ameriških in svetovnih intelektualcev. Pogovarjali se bomo o današnjem svetu, Ukrajini in Združenih državah Amerike. Good morning, professor. In your newest book, you wrote that we live in an age of disarray. What are the most important problems world is facing today?
Pretty simple. We have a few decades, not much, in which we can act decisively to take control of destruction of the environment, which will soon lead to irreversible tipping points, after which we decline to basically destruction of organized human society, with many tragedies, hideous tragedies along the way. That's one. There's a growing threat of terminal nuclear war, both in Europe and in Asia. Going to other issues, there are very likely pandemics on the horizon, which may be much more serious than this one. The industrial agriculture is creating antibiotic-resistant drugs that even attack the immune system, may be out of control. This is all capitalism gone berserk.
What about political questions? We are going through some kind of transition from one world order to a new one. Will this process be a peaceful one?
Confrontations in the international global economic order. Basically, there's a conflict between conception of a unipolar world dominated by the United States through the mechanism of NATO, which has now been expanded by the United States to the Indo-Pacific region in an effort to enlist Europe in its growing war with China, which is not a secret exactly. That's one view. Almost all the rest of the world is calling for a multipolar global international order with several centers of influence and power. This is sometimes framed in terms of conflict between what's called a rule-based order and a UN-based order. The multipolar advocates are calling for a UN-based order. The United States and its allies are calling for a rules-based order. Well, a UN-based order is a pretty clear concept. It means based on the UN Charter, other major treaties. A rules-based order is a little bit obscure. What are the rules? Who sets them? As soon as we ask that question, interesting conclusions begin to arise.
The United States order of Pax Americana is slowly transforming. Are the United States part of the solution or part of the problem?
There's a lot of talk about U.S. decline. That's been going on for decades. You go back to the 80s, you had books with titles like Japan as number one, U.S. is declining. Now it's China's number one, U.S. is declining. There's something to that, something, but not a lot. There are many different dimensions of influence and power. One, of course, is military. Take a look at the military dimension. The U.S. is so far ahead of all other nations combined that it's not even a comparison, way beyond anyone. The declinist argument is mainly based on looking at gross domestic product, GDP. And it's true that, relatively speaking, US GDP has declined since the 1940s. In the 1940s, the United States had maybe 40% of global GDP, and of course that's declined. It's now maybe 20%. But that's not the most obvious measure, particularly in an age of neoliberal globalization. A different measure is the amount of world wealth owned by corporations based in a particular country. That gives you a very different measure. Turns out that about half the wealth of the world is in the hands of US-based multinationals. It's a spectacular figure. They were ahead in virtually every category, mostly first, sometimes second. No one else is even close. On the other hand, this is a somewhat fragile system because the corporate world in the United States has moved towards financialization rather than production. So if you take a major corporation like Apple, say, the world's largest corporation, take a look at its profit. Most of it comes from what economists call rent, not production. It comes from patents, design, exorbitant international property rights, which were radical violation of free market principles imposed as part of the rules-based order in the interests of American capital. That's a pretty fragile system. Corporate world has preferred to have production move to places where labor is much more easily exploitable, cheaper, no human rights, no environmental conditions, more money there. But it means that domestically, the United States is becoming deindustrialized. That's a pretty fragile system. Could change.
We in Europe are facing several problems. Even a new war is not excluded. Is Russia aggression a result of NATO enlargement or Putin's desire to set up a new Russian empire?
Actually, I would say neither. NATO enlargement is plainly a factor that's accepted by practically the whole highest level of the US diplomatic corps, by virtually the entire political class, the current head of the CIA, his predecessors, former defense secretaries. For 30 years, all of them, almost all of them, have been warning Washington that it is reckless and provocative to call for, first of all, for even expansion of NATO in violation to firm promises to Gorbachev. But surely what has been recognized for 30 years as a red line, Ukraine and Georgia, every Russian leader since Yeltsin and Gorbachev has made it plain that we'll tolerate the rest, but not Ukraine and Georgia as members of a hostile military alliance. Has been extremely clear. So it's a factor. Doesn't justify the aggression. Nothing justifies the aggression, but that's a major factor in leading to it. What's Russia's goal? Well, all we know is what they say. I can't read people's minds. That's a big industry, but I'm not part of it. Whether it's George W. Bush looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul and deciding it's good, or current analysts saying, well, what he really wants is to conquer the world. I can't deal with that. We know their statements quite explicitly. Putin, Lavrov. It's concentrated on Ukraine. Constant repetition. We cannot accept Ukraine and Georgia as part of a hostile military alliance with heavy weapons aimed at Russia. Maybe they mean something else. That I can't say. But that's what they've insistently strongly been saying, well, again, the aggression has no justification. The supreme international crime, whatever provocation there will be, there's no justification. But if you want to ask about the reasons, we have a pretty good sense of them.
Is NATO still defense organization, or is becoming, because of several interventions, an organization of aggression?
Not becoming, it's always been an aggressive one. I mean, take a look at the record this recent years. The bombing of Serbia, invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan, destruction of Libya, in violation of the UN security resolution that the aggressors themselves instituted. It goes on and on.
Why the United States does not accept the peace agreement on Ukraine, which was concluded in March last year?
Well, there's an official reason, so we can look at that. The official reason is the United States prefers that the war continue in order to severely weaken Russia, stated over and over, not a secret. There's a pretext. They say, well, we have to continue the war so that Ukraine will be in a better negotiating position. Who says it's going to be in a better negotiating position? Ukraine's being destroyed. I mean, there's no indication that it'll be in a better negotiating position. In fact, this is not just words, it's actions. As I'm sure you know, last March and April, after the invasion, there were negotiations underway between Ukraine and Russia under Turkish auspices. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, flew to Kiev, informed the Zelensky government that Britain and the United States are not in favor of negotiations now. He was followed by Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, who presumably gave his usual message: war must continue to severely weaken Russia. Well, that's all we know. The rest is speculation. So that's a good reason why they wouldn't accept a ceasefire.
Does Ukraine has a right to become a member of NATO?
Sure. Mexico has a right to become a member of a Chinese-run hostile international military alliance. They do have that right. Suppose that there was even a mention of that possibility. Goodbye, Mexico. Yes, they have the right.
Several peace initiatives are going on, a Chinese one. Brazilian president is calling for peace. Even Pope is starting its own peace initiative. What are the chances for success of these initiatives? Are the United States interested in prolonging the war or not?
Brazil is outspoken on the matter, but in fact, if you look, it's the position of most of the world. A large majority of the population of the world is refusing to take part in the sanctions, is making its own independent relations with China and Russia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, on and on. They are calling for a diplomatic political settlement. That's almost the whole world. In fact, even in Europe, if you look at public opinion polls, it's mostly in favor of a political settlement. If you look at the leadership, the intellectual class, no, they're very hawkish, no political settlement, but compare it with popular opinion. In fact, even in Ukraine, of course, if you take, there have been Western Gallup polls of opinion in Ukraine, take nationwide, countrywide, about 75% want to continue the war. But if you go to the polls in the conflicted areas, Donbass, eastern areas, it's about 50-50. Large percentage of the population says, got to stop the horror and move towards some sort of settlement. So Yes, Brazil's Lula is outspoken in saying we should talk about peace, not about war, but he's reflecting opinions that are pretty much worldwide, with exceptions being United States, Britain, leadership class in Europe.
What's your opinion of the last statement by French President Macron that Europe cannot become United States vassal?
Macron is, of course, repeating positions that go back to the end of the Second World War. Has been an issue in global affairs since the end of the Second World War as to whether Europe will become an independent force in world as its culture, economy, population showed to be perfectly reasonable. Will Europe be an independent so-called third force, or will it be subordinated to the United States within the NATO Atlantic system? It's been a struggle all through since the Cold War. Leading person advocating European independence, of course, was Charles de Gaulle, called for Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik was another step in the direction of strengthening Germany's quite natural commercial and other relations with the the resource-rich mineral areas on the east, and Olof Palme, Sweden, and many others. The United States, of course, has been strongly against it. Became a real issue when the Soviet Union collapsed and Mikhail Gorbachev proposed what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with no military alliances, no victor and vanquished, common moves towards a kind of social democratic future. The United States is strongly opposed to that, wants the Atlanticist vision. Vladimir Putin, apart from the crime of aggression, also committed an act of criminal stupidity from his point of view. He handed Europe over to the United States on a golden platter. Washington's greatest wish, Europe subordinated to the United States. Of course, for Europe, this is pretty serious. Could lead to European deindustrialization. We're seeing that, in fact. Right now, it's not just Europe, it's also China. The United States is working hard to pressure European industry. This is especially the Netherlands, which has the most advanced lithographic industry producing minuscule crucial parts for semiconductors. It's the main one in the world. U.S. is trying to press Netherlands to abandon its major market, China. That means serious decline. That's one of many cases. U.S. is pressuring South Korea in some zones, Japan also to abandon the China market to help the U.S. program of trying to prevent China's technological development. It's a pretty savage program, in my opinion, but it's very explicit, nothing secret. We have to stop China's technological development, no matter what the consequences. It's very harmful for the world, of course. China's way in the lead in electrification, sustainable energy, and so on, but we have to stop it because we have to be first. And they're trying to enlist Europe in this. Europe, in many ways, is facing a serious threat. I mean, the natural partner of Europe, with its mostly German-based industrial system, its natural partner is Russia, with not much of an economy, but enormous mineral resources. And of course, farther to the east, the huge China market. U.S. wants to cut that off. For Europe, that's a pretty serious decision. There is in the background the Gorbachev vision of a common European home. That's a version of what's now described as a multipolar world, but all of these issues are very much alive.
A group of Slovenian intellectuals published a statement, "Stop the war in Ukraine." We were accused that we are trying to sell the victim to the aggressor. Why are the peace movement in the world, especially in Europe, in the United States, so weak?
First of all, there is the United States and European educated classes are very hawkish. They're willing to sacrifice Ukraine to the goal of weakening Russia. That's what it amounts to, whatever the words are. When you're opposed to a political, it's true that a political settlement will offer some reward to the aggressor. That's the nature of diplomacy. That's called diplomacy. Diplomacy means neither side gets everything it wants. Both sides get something they can live with. The alternative to diplomacy is continued war. Continued war will probably totally destroy Ukraine, causing enormous suffering elsewhere in the world, may lead to terminal nuclear war. But those are the choices. I mean, there's a lot of talk about aggressors shouldn't have rights. Yes, that's true in the non-existent world. In the real world, unfortunately, they do. So the United States and Britain invaded, virtually destroyed Iraq. They're getting great benefits from it. British Petroleum has one of the major oil contracts for the Ramallah oil field. Others do as well. Enormous benefits. Yes, aggressors shouldn't get rights. And that's true. But the point is, do we want? The choices are very clear. Either the war ends with a diplomatic settlement or it continues. That's logic. Can't argue that. Very likely Ukraine will be pretty much destroyed. Europe will be deindustrialized. In much of the global south, millions of people will be facing starvation. The world will be facing terminal nuclear war. Actually, if you look at the situation objectively, there's only one country that's benefiting from this very clearly. So clearly, it's even publicly discussed, the United States. The United States is getting a tremendous bargain for a fraction, small fraction of the colossal military budget. It's able to degrade the military forces of its main military enemy. I mean, that's so obvious it's even publicly discussed. And that's only the beginning. You look at the fossil fuel companies, military industry, profits are going through the sky as Europe shifts from cheap Russian gas to expensive US gas. Profits are booming. They don't even, in fact, the major companies, Chevron and Exxon, right now, you read the business press, they don't know what to do with their profits. They don't know where to invest them. Mm. The US is doing wonderfully from the war. You can ask whether that's the reason why the US wants to do it, but I won't speculate about that. But the facts are very clear.
The American neocon consider China to be the biggest enemy. Is a war between these two great powers a real danger?
Well, there's a lot of war talk in the United States, even up to the level of generals, brigadier generals, who are saying we're going to be at war with China in 2 years. All of that is beyond insanity. You cannot have a war, between nuclear powers. That's the end of everything. It's insanity. The United States is being extremely provocative, both militarily and economically. Official US policy, I'll just quote it, is to encircle China in a ring of sentinel states, heavily armed with US-supplied precision weapons aimed at China. US nuclear-capable B-52s are for the first time being stationed permanently in Northern Australia, Guam, Okinawa, all aimed at China. Huge naval maneuvers in the Pacific aimed at China. That's the military dimension. On the economic dimension, the US is openly, publicly, nothing hidden, saying we must prevent China's economic development. And it's acting to try to implement that. I mentioned some examples. Well, that does lead to a potential threat of war.
What will happen in the United States after next year presidential elections? Are the chances for some changes, or everything will stay the same?
Well, that's a serious issue in itself. American democracy is in a very fragile state. The Republican Party is openly committed to trying to undermine American democracy. It's not a secret. Their model, their hero, is Viktor Orban. He's the one who's invited as keynote speaker in their conferences, the meeting that he organized of right-wing groups in Hungary. A little while ago, Trump was the major speaker. They lauded him for his achievements and so on. That's what they want America to do. And they're quite openly saying, if we have to try to prevent voting of the wrong people, we'll do that. They might succeed. If we do, democracy is a pretty fragile entity.
Are you optimistic about the future of the mankind?
Well, I'll go back to the comment that Gramsci made famous. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have no other choice.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for the interview.
Sure.